Now, from the moment of his birth, Despero, who is the main character in a book by Kate DiCamillo called The Tale of Despero. Now, they made it into a movie, which I didn't see because I heard it was terrible and not as good as the book. So that's just a plug for books. And Kate DiCamillo is a great children's author. So from the moment of his birth, Despero is weird. He does not fit in with the other mice. He loves the light. But not only does he love the light, he loves books, and he loves music. He reads the words. He was born knowing how to read. All the other mice just see squiggles. And when he hears melodies, he loves them. But all the other mice, they just hear noise or nothing. From the moment of his birth, Despero's eyes are open to the joy around him. The joy of light and stories and music and even of love. Now mice, they didn't know anything about love. But one fateful day, Despero hears the most beautiful music he's ever heard. And it's sweet, and he feels like the sound itself is like light, shining through a stained glass window. And he thinks it's as captivating as any storybook could possibly be. So he forgets all his fear, and he forgets the mouse law about not making contact with humans, and he finds himself creeping closer and closer to the music, and soon he is face to face with the princess. Her name's the Princess P. She lives in the castle, and he immediately falls in love with her, and she touches him on the head. Well, it's not long before all the other mice find out. And the mice say he has broken the mouse law, and the punishment of this breach of mouse law is death by rat. Which means, not nice, it essentially means being thrown in the dungeon where the rats will eat you. Now, Despero's brother, who is just a regular mouse, who has never liked Despero, because Despero is weird, his name is Furlow. He comes to take him to the mouse council. And Despero asks him, do you know what love is? And Furlow's kind of like, huh? Love? What are you talking about? And Despero says, there's somebody who loves me and I love her. And Furlow says, someone who loves you, what difference does that make? You are in big trouble. You're going to die in the dungeon. What matters is that you broke the law. You, Furlow says, are making a fool of yourself. Now, that passage we read from 1 Corinthians is not necessarily totally clear on first reading, but what Paul is telling us, in part in that passage, is that love is like that, and so are the other mysteries of God. They often make us look foolish to people who don't understand. He reminds us that there will always be people who don't get it, who are confused by such strange concepts of love and grace and joy. People who trust their own wisdom, and they label everyone who doesn't fit into their worldview a fool. Paul reminds the Corinthians that to become God's fool is to find true wisdom, and that to be a caretaker, I don't know if you heard that, a steward, he says, of God's mysteries. A caretaker of God's mysteries is a great privilege and a great responsibility. The mysteries of God need caretakers, Paul tells us. He doesn't elaborate there, but it's a beautiful image. We are the caretakers of God's mysteries. He needs us, God needs us to tend them, to be good stewards who recognize God's presence within the mysteries themselves and who are committed to sharing those mysteries of joy and grace and love with other people. So, Despero is sentenced and he is thrown into the dungeon. And Despero is lying on his back at the bottom of the steps in pitch darkness. He touches all his bones at one by one, and he's surprised that they are all still there and none of them are actually broken. He gets to his feet and he becomes aware of a terrible, foul smell. The dungeon stank of despair and suffering and hopelessness, he says. And it was so dark. Despereaux had never encountered such darkness before. The darkness, he says, had a physical presence as if it were a being all its own. The mouse held up one paw in front of his whiskers, and he couldn't see it. And he had the alarming thought that perhaps he, Despereaux Tilling, did not even exist. Isaiah tells us it's like that with darkness. Now, we just read a little part of Isaiah, but some of you know Isaiah passages from back maybe at Christmas time. We're still in the season of Epiphany. We're still talking about the light of God shining in the darkness. But before Isaiah wrote, "The people who walked in darkness shall see a great light," he warned them, the darkness is overwhelming, and you will be tempted to find a way out of the darkness, a way that doesn't include God. You'll be tempted to listen to other people and think you can fix the darkness yourself. Isaiah, earlier than the passage we just read, says you have to wait for the Lord. No one can fix the darkness by themselves. That's an important message, because all of us sitting here have had experience with darkness. All of us know someone, or for ourselves, who have felt darkness as Despereaux did, maybe a separate being that almost makes us wonder if we exist or not. When your heart is broken and your grief is so heavy you're not sure you can carry it, maybe your fear is choking you, fear of something not going well or not working out, or just fear of the future in general. When the world is going crazy and people you care about are in pain, when religious institutions are guilty of hurting the people they were supposed to take care of, and the politicians have gone nuts, and there doesn't seem to be much hope around. The reminder from Isaiah, from earlier in Isaiah, is that the light will come. Indeed, the light has come. You can't fix it without God's love and grace and peace. So there in the dungeon, in the darkness, Despereaux is trying to be brave. We've all, in some way, been there, and we've seen others in darkness. And sometimes it's easier just to go to bed, or, just hide for a while. But there Despereaux is, and he's trying to be brave. He remembers the books in the castle library, and he decides to tell himself a story. He begins out loud, "Once upon a time." All of a sudden, a very gruff voice interrupts him. "Once upon a time?" It's the jailer, Gregory. He's been in that dungeon by himself for decades. He has a rope tied to his leg so he won't get lost in the darkness. Now, he decides to ridicule Despereaux for a little while. It doesn't get much fun. So he tells Despereaux about the dungeon and how the rats are going to come and what the rats are going to do to him and how they will eat every last bit of him except his bones. Not a very nice guy at first. Despereaux pleads, "But I need to live. I can't die. I am in love." Gregory scoffs and tells Despereaux how foolish love is. But then he says, "I will save your life, Mouse." And Despereaux says, "Why would you save me?" "Because, Mouse, you can tell Gregory a story." Gregory had heard the "once upon a time." And so he tells the mouse, "Stories are light. I will save you if you can make light for Gregory. Light is precious in a world so dark. Begin at the beginning. Tell Gregory a story. Make some light." Tell the story. Make some light. It is why we gather in places like this. Even when it's snowing, even when we have so much work to do and we'd rather stay in bed, or we have to be out, doing home repair or going to the grocery store. There's so many things that really we could be doing. But we gather here, and in Sunday school classrooms, and in Bible studies, and at youth events, and even out in the garden, wherever it is that we gather, we do it to be reminded of the story, our story of life, the story of Jesus Christ. We gather together to hear again about God's amazing mysteries, God's love, God's grace, and to be reminded that even in that darkness that we all face at some time, we have someone to hold on to. Just like one of the songs we sang reminded us. God is holding on to us as well. That's what our story of life also says. Because sometimes you can't see to reach out. Where could God be? And what we believe is that God is holding on to us. But not only do we come here to hear the story, we also come to be prepared to go out and tell the story. Because as hard as life can be for all of us, there are people in the world, we all know, who face circumstances more frightening, more desperate than our own. And so, as servants of Christ, as Paul said, as stewards of God's mysteries, we are called to share the stories, to share the light. And that is what we read today in Isaiah 42. I am the Lord, I have called you to righteousness. I have taken you by the hand and kept you. I have given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison, those who sit in darkness. Despero does that. He escapes from the darkness. And later, when the Princess P is kidnapped, she is taken by the rats. She is taken to the dungeon. And our Despero has to decide, will he face the darkness again willingly to bring light to someone he loves? Switching gears just a little bit. Put Despero right here. It'll go together in a second, but it seems like whiplash, maybe. We're switching to a different story in a completely different place. Perhaps you've read the book or heard of the book, The Hiding Place, by Corrie ten Boom. Corrie ten Boom was a Christian, and along with her family, they lived in Holland during the Second World War, and they hid Jews in their home during the Holocaust. Now, eventually, Corrie ten Boom and her whole family, they were arrested when they were betrayed by neighbors. So the Jews that were hiding in their home and their entire family were taken to a concentration camp, and they were moved to different concentration camps at different times. And her story, The Hiding Place, chronicles her time, and that she was with her sister Betsy, and all that time they spent in the camp. It's an amazing story of faith. And at the very end, Betsy has died, her father has died, she doesn't know about the rest of her family, so she is truly alone. But the Allies are on their way, and so the Nazis have started releasing prisoners. And especially, she was a Christian, and so she was told she could leave, just leave. But she didn't pass the physical. They were still giving physicals, and her legs were so swollen, her ankles. Some of us know what that's like. And from times in our lives when we're ill or we're, whatever's happening, you can get water on your ankles and your legs. And they wouldn't let her leave. So they sent her to the hospital wing in the concentration camp. There she made her way to a bunk, and she said it was awful. It smelled, and there had been a train accident. A train full of Jewish prisoners had collided with another train, and they hadn't offered them any medical care. They had brought them to this hospital in this concentration camp, and these were the women from the train, and they were in agony, and they were hollering all night long and groaning. And so she found her way to a bunk, and she propped up her legs, because the only way for that swelling to go down, the only way for her to get out of that horrible place was to prop her legs up, so that the swelling would go down. At some time in the middle of the night, she started hearing a word that the women were saying over and over. Sheber, Sheber, or Scheiber. She didn't know what it meant. She didn't know what these poor, suffering women were saying, but she knew they were in agony. And their throats were rasping, and they just kept saying it, she-bird. Finally, somehow she figured it out. They were asking for bedpans. Those poor women who had been in that accident, they couldn't get up. Sometimes they were 3 to a cot anyway, or to a bunk. And she looked at her legs, felt them, that they were heavy, and she thought, if she lowers them, she'll never get out of this darkness, this concentration camp, this horror. And yet there were these women she didn't even know. But because she carried God's light in her, she knew she had to be a steward of his mysteries, to tend the light that she'd been given. And so she lowered her legs, and she spent several hours taking bedpans from cot to cot, from woman to woman. And she said they would say to her, really not understanding each other well, but she knew they were saying, "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" As though cruelty and callousness were the norm, and ordinary decency the marvel. She writes, as a wintry dawn crept through the windows, I realized it was Christmas Day. Now, Christmas is a few weeks, several behind us, but we're still in Epiphany, when we celebrate God's light being revealed in small and big ways. Love is a marvel, she tells us. Grace is a mystery. It seems incomprehensible against the backdrop of cruelty and apathy, and yet that is who God sent into this world in his Son, Jesus Christ our Lord, and it is what he calls us to be, stewards of those mysteries, people who tend God's light. Corrie ten Boom was a careful steward of God's mysteries that day. She nurtured and she tended the light of God, and she told God's story not with her words, but by how she served the people around her. And Despero, that little mouse, he did the same. He decided to face his fears, and he went back down into the dungeon. But before he went, he was invited by the cook to sit at the king's table and eat the special, delicious soup. Now, you'll have to read the story, but Despero sits at the king's table, and he is filled with courage because of the soup that he eats there. And he goes down and he carries the joy and the light into the darkness of the dungeon to someone who needs it more than he does, the lovely Princess P. So here's the thing, as Christians, in the waters of baptism, we are reborn with our eyes open, like Despero was. Our eyes are open. And as we grow as Christians, our courage, like Despero's, is bolstered when we share at the table of the King. Maybe not soup, but the bread and the cup. We are prepared to go out and carry the light of Jesus Christ to those in need. We're called to care and to tend. And we're to do what Despero, what Corrie ten Boom, what Jesus Christ himself, what all God's people for generations have done. No one would say it's easy. But Scripture tells us it is indeed good news. Thanks be to God. Amen.